And so there's the hero and the adversary, roughly speaking. And, you know, there's all sorts of movies where the protagonist is an anti-hero, you know, and those movies are usually there to show you bad examples in some sense. Or you get mixed characters like Batman, eh? And he's tangled up with the Joker, and as the Joker points out in that brilliant performance, they're mirror images of one another. And so, the Joker's an adversary. It's more complicated than that. But so, some of the symbols that commonly represent the individual in symbolic representations are, well, and also conceptual representations are ego, consciousness, the trickster, Bugs Bunny is a good example of a trickster, the fool, the hero, the coward, spirit as opposed to matter or as opposed to dogma, the son of the unknown, and the son of the king. So, and those are very, very common figures, and I'll walk you through some of that as we progress today. So, and then there's the figure of the adversary. So you see on the left-hand side there, you see Horus, who's the bird-headed god of Egypt, who I told you about, who represents the capacity to pay attention. Very important concept, because the Egyptians realized, and really it's brilliant, it is something modern people do not understand, because we tend to make rationality the highest god. That's not a good thing. That's a pathway to totalitarianism. What the Egyptians knew, but they only knew it in symbolic form, was it was the capacity to attend to things that in some sense was the highest psychological function. Because it's the capacity to pay attention that actually moves you beyond what you only know. And rationality tends to make, you know, integral systems that are coherent, that are box-like, and then claim that they're absolutely right. Whereas attention is always looking beyond what you know. And attention is an unbelievably powerful force. You know, that's why advertisers pay for it. That's why people demand it. That's why children can't live without it. That's why it's what you want from your friends and your family. You want them to pay attention to you. It's an unbelievably valuable resource. And so, one of the things I always tell my clients, for example, if they're socially anxious, I say, look, pay more attention to the person you're talking to. If you really pay close attention to them, then the thoughts that are making you anxious will be suppressed. And because you're paying close attention to them, you'll match your movements to theirs, and you'll match your conversation to them, and then there's no reason for you to be socially anxious, because socially anxious people will go like this when they're talking. You know, they don't want to look at you. Of course, how the hell can you engage anyone if you're not in a little dance with them? You know, you can't, and a lot of it's nonverbal, it's physical, and it's embodied, and without paying attention, then you lose people. And you see this with speakers all the time too. They're in front of audiences. They have their paper and they're going like this. And usually they're talking like this too. And you know, the logical thing to do in that case is like look at Facebook or get the hell out of there or something. But they're not paying attention to the audience. And so there's no power in the dynamic conversation at all. So anyway, so there's Horus, and then there's the guy on the right there is Set, and he's like the precursor of the Christian representation of Satan. In fact, the name Satan seems to have been a transformation of the name Set. And Set is actually, he's like the god of totalitarian possibility, because in Egyptian mythology, he represents the evil brother of the rightful king, who's always plotting to overthrow the rightful king. And Horus is his natural enemy. And what this means, I tell you, man, it's really important. So I have in my clinical practice frequently people who are stuck in the middle of absolutely moronic bureaucracy. So I can give you an example of this. I just love this. One of my clients who worked for a large corporation, who's a pretty sensible woman, she was being driven mad by the political correctness that had infected the organization. And she sent me a 32 email letter exchanges that were circulating around the word flip chart. I don't know if any of you have heard the flip chart controversy, but it's pretty mind-bogglingly moronic. And so the deal was that somebody, you know what a flip chart is, right? It's one of those paper pads that you flip paper over. Well, it turns out, hypothetically, that flip is a pejorative term for Filipinos. And so they believed that the flip chart phrase was no longer acceptable because it was potentially offensive to Filipinos, although I bet they would have had to like vacuum up the whole planet to find one Filipino who actually cared whether or not someone called that a flip chart. You know, and that person would have had plenty of problems that were worse than that. Anyway, there was like a 32 serious email exchanges about what terminology should be used, instead of flip chart, you know. So that's what people were doing instead of trying to actually have a life and do something useful. And it was driving her completely mad. They did rename them and made it, it made part of corporate policy that it was inappropriate to use the word flip chart. I don't remember what the hell they called them. Who knows? But the reason I'm telling you this story is a lot of you are going to find yourself embedded in bureaucracies. And, you know, and there's that for better or for worse. And one of the things that is going to happen to you is that people are going to ask you to do stupid and ridiculous things. And the fact that they're asking you to do stupid and ridiculous things is going to do three things to you. One is it'll warp you so that you'll pretend that you agree with it, and then eventually you will, and like, good, so much for your soul. And then the other thing is that it'll demotivate you, because you'll think, why should I be like slaving away at this job when, you know, I'm being pecked to death by morons with stupid rules. And the third thing that it'll do is make you resentful and irritated, and that will also undermine your motivation and make your life miserable. And so you might think, well, what should you do about that? And the answer to that is, you should object at the earliest possible point, because first of all, you'll find that if you object to radical stupidity when it first emerges, you kind of make people aware of the fact that what they're doing is radically stupid, and they'll usually back off. And so then they won't torture you to death. So, you know, you have to take a risk, which is, oh no, what happens if I complain about this? But, you know, it's another one of those situations where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So if you complain, that'll cause some trouble. Although usually it causes way less trouble than you'd think, because people are generally not very courageous. And if you push them with some strength when they're doing something absolutely moronic, they'll usually back off because they don't know what to do when they're being challenged. And then you won't have to put up with it for the rest of your life. And so why I'm telling you this is because all sorts of bureaucratic entities, corporations, government institutions, non-profit organizations, anything that's above a certain size, because it doesn't matter if it's government or corporate, it's all the same bloody foolishness when it gets too big, is like those things tend towards totalitarian structures. It's part of the innate danger that's associated with social organization. And so then you might say, well, how do you keep the enterprise that you're part of alive and dynamic, and also keep it a place that a sensible person who's got a proper orientation could stand to work? And the answer is, do not do things you know to be stupid. Stand up and say, look, that's dumb, I'm not doing it. And if they ask you why, then you can say, well, A, I think it's stupid. B, if I do it, I'm going to get irritated and resentful. And also, if I do it, it's going to decrease my motivation. So I'm not doing it. And then if they push you too hard, it's like, hey, it's time for a different job. And that might be the best thing that ever happened to you, because if the structure you're in is going in that direction, and you can't stop it, it's like, get the hell out of there and find something else. So it's not that hard to find a job when you already have a job. That's another thing to keep in mind too. You know, whenever you're working, and you will be, especially in the world of today where jobs are relatively uncertain, is you should always have an escape route planned. And it should be active, because if you don't have an escape route and you can't get away, you can't say no. And if you can't say no, you can't bargain, and if you can't bargain, you're a slave. So that's how the world is set out at the moment. It's probably always been like that, but it's something that you really need to know, because you got to watch. If your being is objecting to something that someone is forcing you to do, maybe you're right. Maybe you shouldn't be doing it. And lots of people end up living meaningless lives. And that's not a very good term, because there's no such thing as a meaningless life. Because one of the meanings of life is suffering. And there's no bloody way you're going to escape that. So you will not have a meaningless life. You'll have a life that's only suffering. And I wouldn't recommend that, because it'll make you one miserable creature, and plus you'll warp everyone around you because you'll be vengeful. So these things are really important. They're really important. So, all right, so the individual, as like culture and like nature, also has its negative element. Jung would call that the shadow. You know, and we're going to discuss the shadow in some detail, because one of the things that Jung believed, and he kind of got this idea from Nietzsche, was that when you grow up, and maybe as a consequence of your temperament, you tend to think that some of your attributes are good and some of them are negative, you know. So you make moral judgments about them, and fair enough. So, you know, you might think, for the psychoanalysts, the two elements of human being that were commonly regarded as negative from a moral perspective were sexuality and aggression. But Jung's notion is that, well, you know, you might be someone who's modest and careful and never causes any conflict, and then we might say, well, you're a well-socialized person. But Jung's point would be, yeah, but you got no power. You've got no power. And so people are just going to roll right over you. So you better dive into that morass of sexuality and aggression and pull out those powers and integrate them into your psyche so that you can use them consciously, because without that, you're harmless. But, you know, I don't think that's a very good ambition. You know, what do you want to be when you're 30? Well, I want to be harmless. It's like, you know, really, that's what you want to be? It's like you might as well not even be if that's your goal. So, you know, this dichotomy between the positive individual and the negative individual is very, very complex, because what's positive and what's negative is not obvious from the beginning, and arbitrary judgments don't help. It's very difficult for a given individual to look at themselves and say, well, what is it about me that's actually worth developing?